mission statement when going into the project was that we were going to undertake a lot of lighthouse projects. We tackled the situation that way. The department responsible for culture was handling a lot of different things, and that's why we decided to organize the survey, and we decided to ask people the extent to which cultural work was of relevance to older people and the extent to which this was reflected in the guidelines of the city and the state. We tried to figure out whether there were certain passages and objectives in which the target groups were defined, what exactly in the cities that were being polled had been recognized as the main difficulty in reaching senior citizens and older people. This is something that we did via Eurocities, as we said earlier. In this network of cities, I don't know the figure exactly, we have 200 to 300 European cities who have basically united under this umbrella, about 100 of which are engaged in the field of culture on a regular basis, and we took advantage of the distribution list to send out the surveys. And we did receive some responses. 56 interviews from 45 cities, and that's due to the fact that various answers came from various different cities distributed amongst about 20 countries. The distribution is disparate across Europe. In Germany, we received a lot of responses. We received a lot from Finland, from Poland as well. But overall, I must say that almost all of the EU member states participated. And I think it's safe to say that we were able to gain a small picture of who is actually addressing this topic and who is doing things to accomplish something in this field. Now, this is something that I'm assuming, and it's up to interpretation. I think that member cities in Eurocities, at least to a certain degree, don't really know exactly what to do with this topic. They may find it on their desk, but they don't necessarily know what to do with creative aging, and therefore it might have been difficult for them to respond. But in cases where this is complicated, now I wouldn't wager to say what things would have gone like if we had not been involved in the Erasmus Plus project and had received this question and had to respond to it without any preparation. I'm not sure whether, given our backdrop with a position that is perceived to be weak in this environment, we might not have found it really difficult and felt that it involved a lot of work and perhaps might have placed it on a back burner. But be that as it may, we have quite a broad landscape of responses. We have aggregated the responses quite highly. This information is still pro forma. We are going to continue evaluating it, but I think there are 6 takeaways from this. So you can see that at least a third of the cities responding didn't have any city guidelines. They had no guidelines in government politics. That's what we would call it in Berlin, which specified content in relation to culture and senior citizens and older people. Now, we can break this down in more detail, but it's a little difficult because we're talking about percentages of percentages. It's a great mathematical task. Amongst those who responded, 64% said, yes, we have general guidelines which deal with city policy, and they all have something to do with culture, so there are culture-related guidelines, and of that, 81% responded that the topic of culture and senior citizens was broached in some way, shape, or form. But as you can see quite clearly, this means that 66% don't really say what you're supposed to do when you're dealing with senior citizens. They don't even define the group. We hardly ever discuss issues when we're talking about people who are 80 and older. But when you go down a little bit, when you talk about people who are over 60 or 65 or 70, things are different. At the European Union level, we are discussing this with respect to pensions and the retirement age. Some countries set it at 60, some at 65. It's very disparate. And so therefore, this also plays a role. Now, in terms of content, what does the situation look like? We differ between structural and thematic questions, and our takeaways are basically distributed in equal shares between structural and substantive questions. We asked what exactly was addressed in these guidelines, and it was interesting to hear that it was mostly libraries, inclusion, and public spaces. And if you look at this wonderful board, which was created by Mrs. Bartsch, she loves word clouds. She's a fan of it, and she has made this tool popular amongst us. I think it is great. What is bigger is what has been mentioned more frequently than anything else, and you can see that these three topics are highlighted here. But if you look at other related topics such as accessibility, and you mustn't forget that libraries are also considered to have a low barrier of entry. You don't need to pay to get into them. You don't need to acquire a ticket first. So a lot has to do with accessibility in various shapes and form. So this was addressed very frequently, and quite often these city guidelines revolve around these topics. Now, coming back to the structural questions and topics, namely the finding that cultural offerings and ways for older people to participate often compete against each other. Now, we all know this. You can only spend every penny once. And I'm not sure if that applies to Swedish crowns. You can only spend your money once. And the question is what to dedicate your funds to, because indirectly it means that you're going to spend them on one thing without being able to spend them on the other. And in the administrations, we hardly ever see the pointer that funds are being spent keeping older people in the back of your mind. They are never mentioned specifically. Now, of course, when they speak about schools for youth, that excludes senior citizens. Otherwise, they are just usually implied. But we often found that of about 50,000 music students in Berlin, only 5,000 are not younger than 25, and 25 is not retirement age yet, is it? So, despite all of the definitions that you may impart to senior citizens, the retirement age of 25 is something that is definitely off the table. So, we definitely have a problem here. The question is how to tackle it. Now, this is a very simple chart, which basically reiterates what I said before. 60% of all of those polls said, yes, indeed, there's competition here. And on principle, those who indicate that funds are dedicated to a certain age group have something to do with the fact that there are also other purposes that sometimes are deemed more preferential or are higher up on the priority list. On our questionnaire, we asked what the greatest obstacles were perceived to be. So we're talking about the barriers for older people to participate in cultural life. And at first glance, the response was quite surprising. We were astonished that it wasn't social isolation, because we asked these people in the midst of the pandemic, and that is probably what would have come up in everyone's mind. Economic barriers isn't a great surprise either, because a pension isn't any reward for gainful employment. In Germany, we always like speaking about the minimum pension level. It's supposed to hover around 50% of the net income of the individual before going into retirement, but quite often the amount is much lower. And we also know that a lot of senior citizens receive benefits, and therefore there are financial barriers, because sometimes they have to buy an admission ticket, they have to pay to get into cultural events, but digital content was also mentioned. But wasn't digital content, the digital route, one of the solutions to reaching people at home during the pandemic, where they were cut off from cultural institutions and venues that they couldn't frequent due to the lockdown? Well, here again, we have another wonderful word cloud, which illustrates this quite wonderfully. Economic barriers, social isolation, but you can also see digital content, cost, accessibility, and financial issues in quite large print. And we also have the cost of digital equipment. And these are examples of the fact that quite obviously in a number of cities it was perceived that the digital space represented a possibility, but that it wasn't considered anything that worked automatically. And we also asked about the level of knowledge that the individuals polled actually had when it comes to the promotion of cultural participation of older people. And indeed, a large number of respondents told us that this topic was definitely becoming much more important, even though the shares and quotas in the cities, especially in the big metropolises, which act like a great magnet to people, is not going to be so dramatic. From a medium size onwards, the percentages will shift and the absolute numbers will also increase. And overall, the population is aging. So the topic of greater diversity amongst the cohort of senior citizens is increasing, and the absolute number of people who are no longer of an age where life is that easy is increasing as well. And if you start from a position of basic law that we heard mention made of earlier today, it seems that we really need to pay more attention to these people. Now, another question was the influence of the coronavirus pandemic on the cultural offerings and possibilities for older people to participate in cultural life. And this is something that generated quite a lot of feedback. In the green field, you can see that the response was online culture and digital content, first and foremost. But you can see that it's also a difficult undertaking because some people don't have the equipment, because in the care homes, as we heard at an event, I think it was 2 years ago in Berlin, the Republika, there was a woman who was promoting policies for old people. 52% of the institutions in which senior citizens live long-term don't have Wi-Fi, and then it is completely irrelevant if you have a wonderful online offering because you're not going to reach them. And very often you cannot afford this, or you're forced to pay for this out of pocket. And I don't really think that we can expect senior citizens to access the internet only through their cell phones. And we also have complete stop and isolation, which shouldn't be that surprising as barriers. Now, digital participation, as I said earlier, represents an opportunity as well as new barriers. New barriers because conveying digital content and digital accessibility until the pandemic weren't really made that much use of. And on top of that, with respect to older people, we didn't really believe that we depended that much on it. But now it has moved into the limelight, and now it has become evident that this situation is difficult to handle. And by the way, this applies not only to schools, which also face the same problem. The transition to conveying digital content also proved to be extremely difficult, but it also presented a host of new opportunities. Now, what do the institutions want to achieve? What measures are supported? Well, here we can see that the response rates were quite high across the board. We had social relations, active cultural production, cultural participation. They all generated a high degree of response. And these figures go all the way down to dismantling barriers, where they're still extremely high. But then you can see, starting at cultural education, we have a more significant drop, and the decrease is even more marked. We don't know exactly what the reasons for this is. We do have some assumptions, but every survey of this type, whenever a question is asked, leads to two further questions being asked as follow-on questions, which are the why questions, and you ask yourself why certain issues are not promoted as much as others. Digital participation, for example, is it because there wasn't enough money to do so, or whether there was not enough manpower or not enough skilled labor, or not the right people? You know that we have a big problem with skilled labor in Germany, so it is not very easy to find people at the drop of a hat who are willing to work in this field. Therefore, I think it's safe to say that it's not a matter of course. In summary, these were the key takeaways from the survey, and it results in this picture. On top, you can see the structural issues, including the competition. Anyone who wants to build something and establish something, and now this brings me back to the situation in Berlin to a certain degree. If in Berlin you want to build something like Luminate Berlin, perhaps, and you don't have any additional funds, what that means in the beginning is that you have to siphon some funds off of other areas. And of course, this is going to meet with resistance. And of course, you need to lobby in order to achieve your goal. And from a political standpoint, it is not very easy to initiate this type of process if indeed you decide to do so. But as I said before, the absolute figures amongst the older population speak for themselves. And I don't believe that you really have to put humanitarian arguments on the table, because if something affects 43% of the city population, I don't think you need much more by way of rationale to actually get things going. Now, I think that the next question is anticipated to a certain degree with this slide, and the question is, how can we move on from here? I think we need to find ways to dedicate ourselves more to the older age group. We need to define it in more precise terms, and we have to figure out exactly how that cohort is structured. Very often we speak about older people and we lump them all in together, as if we had the same level of education across the board, as if we were talking about people who were engaged in culture to the same degree from the beginning. But indeed, we have people who used to read their whole lives, other people who haven't read that much at all. We have people who come from different countries, people with different degrees of education, and I think that because of this, we need to take a differentiated approach to this entire target group, unlike how you would approach other age groups. Furthermore, what we realized from the survey is that libraries are really important. Hurdles to entry are very important. Libraries are a good example because they have absolutely no hurdles, absolutely no barriers. In Berlin, we have launched a library development program, and in times of fiscal difficulty, we have tried to implement it. We have made progress, and that's quite nice because we have established one guiding principle as making these spaces a third living space. And we need to work on ensuring that this also includes older people. What this means in the post-pandemic era is to raise trust and confidence amongst that age group so that they feel that they are safe and secure in these spaces. So that means that the libraries have something to do, but we also have different realms of culture, don't we? We have enumerated everything that is addressed by my department as well. We have regional museums, municipal museums, music schools, conservatories. We need to figure out how to consider older people more in all of these social and public spaces. And I think that we can learn quite a lot from other cities, not only from those who are in our consortium, but also from other cities. We can see from the responses that we've received that there are still a host of other countries out there in Europe who could share their experiences with us, and it would behoove us to reach out to them. At least it would be very helpful for us in Berlin. And I already addressed the point that there's competition with other age groups, and the issue of barriers is also important. As I mentioned before, we need to figure out how the digital space can represent not just an additional challenge for many older people, and how it can make a contribution to participation instead. At the same event that I spoke about, which was held 2 years ago, with the Wi-Fi connection for people in care homes, which was basically non-existent, the woman representing the organization said that it is not digital competence that we need, but digital sovereignty for older people that should be striven for. Digital sovereignty, especially for older people, is something that should be strived for. So digital and media competence, if there were an order, is something that you should introduce amongst older people first. This is a viewpoint, a perspective in relation to the question of how to convey digital competencies and media competencies, which is diametrically opposed to what we can see and hear and read day in and day out. We always hear that the young people have to be trained in these areas. There's no doubt about that. But the older strata of society should also be addressed. Because there are some areas where people can only be addressed digitally, and we have already heard that it is possible that we might be hit with the next wave of corona in the fall, and I don't think that we will have overcome all of the digital hurdles by then. And therefore, this is a topic that remains to be worked on. I think that perhaps other cities have progressed much farther. And in our consortium, we had a wide range. And we had cities with a lot of experience, with little experience, and almost no experience. So we had a lot of divergence here, and that means that we have a lot of potential to tap into. So I have come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.